I was very afraid that I was just going to walk in front of a car,
Right.
that somehow all of this fear and pain, I didn't specifically think of suicide. I wasn't specifically thinking, I want to end this all. I
Mm.
just was afraid if I'm walking down the street, I might just jump in front of a moving car. Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. This week's episode is special. This is an episode of a podcast called Grieve Then Achieve, hosted by Kate Nuds, that I was a guest on and shared about my story and talked about the concept of grief as a survivor. I think you're really going to enjoy this.
So, hello and welcome, Manya. Thank you so much for joining me on the Grieve Then Achieve podcast.
I'm really glad to be here, Kate.
It was a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I thank you very much for returning the favour. I think this is going to be such an interesting conversation between us because this is slightly different grief to perhaps the other people that I've had on different episodes. So, tell me about your grief journey. Tell me about you and why we're talking today.
My grief journey started, and to address what you just said, I didn't even realize it was a grief journey. I didn't understand what grief was. I am a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. I am so thankful that I did not have any physical injuries. However, I walked away and thought I was okay, but I wasn't. I developed post-traumatic stress, and that seriously impacted my life, my ability to function, all of those things that anybody who's gone through grief can understand.
Mm.
And as I said, at the time, I didn't recognize the role grief was playing in the midst of all the other emotions that I was feeling. I was directly across the street from the first bomb, so I saw it explode, and my brain knew something was going on and that I was in danger, and I was frozen in place. And then the second bomb went off about 12 seconds later, and I turned to look down the street and see that cloud of smoke rising and realized this is bad. We have to get out of here. And with my friends, we evacuated. And as I said, initially, I thought, okay, that was awful. I witnessed a murder.
Yeah.
I'm okay. Thank goodness. And as I say, quickly realized that I wasn't okay. And it's only looking back that I recognize the grief of that loss, losing the life I had before, losing the innocence of traumatic things don't happen to me, to people like me, to people in this neighborhood, which is, I realize now, was a naive viewpoint, but I think I was just sad for all of those losses.
Of course. And we're in such a bubble, aren't we? That's really resonated with me where you said, yeah, this doesn't happen to me. This doesn't happen to me. I'm in my little bubble. And then it does happen. What showed up for you? Because you said you realized that you weren't okay. What was that realization? What did that look like?
It was a couple of things. And one was that I isolated myself. I was afraid to talk to people, largely because I was afraid of sharing that I was struggling, because we weren't hearing the story about people with mental health wounds. And I had people say along the lines of, well, of course you're okay. You didn't have any physical injuries. And, and later on had people say, nothing really happened to you, suck it up. So
Right.
early on, I got the message that this isn't the story people are talking about.
Mm.
And I don't want to be vulnerable and share that I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
And also recognize now as I look back that that kind of isolating myself was a go-to coping mechanism when something difficult
Yeah.
happened. Just I'm gonna close in on myself and figure out how to deal with it, even knowing that I don't even know how to deal with it, but I'm just gonna somehow figure it out on my own. So that isolation was one piece of it. And the other piece of it was losing my ability to function in life. I was able to do the basics, get up in the morning, take a shower, go to work. Um, I didn't do much work when I was working, but I had, this is now me at work, staring at the computer, unable to focus. Was able to dress myself, all of those things. So from the outside, you wouldn't know, but I had trouble sleeping. When I did sleep, I had just horrific nightmares. I had trouble eating, making food, buying food, just the simplest. The night after, the bombing was on a Monday. Tuesday, I realized I didn't have any food, or there was no food I wanted to eat in my refrigerator. I ended up going to just the local convenience store and I got corn chips and queso for dinner. And I think that's what I had for about 3 or 4 days. Just that was all I could manage to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
In retrospect, it makes me smile thinking that was that my comfort food? Did I just see it and it was easy? It is not something that I typically eat. And there were tears, many, many, many tears. I am a generally sensitive person, so tears are not a surprise for me. That is also a go-to coping mechanism. This was on a scale I'd never seen before.
Right. So there was a level that you normally, so a sensitive level, and this was a deeper level than that.
Absolutely, yes. And I think a lot of your listeners, whatever their experiences are, will understand this. I felt like I was just this raw nerve. Just anything would set me off.
Right.
And anything in terms of something happening in my environment or somebody saying something to me or not saying something to me. And again, in retrospect, I realized, my body was in fight or flight mode. I was still, part of the challenge of post-traumatic stress is that your body stays in that mode to protect you. So I realize now that's where a lot of this kind of that feeling came from. But I was just, it did not take much to set me off to crying or having an anxiety attack. Um, and in my case, that an anxiety attack manifests itself that I need to move to just keep things, to somehow take care of it. It involves a lot of movement. So I had many times where I was just kind of, running in place, trying to get out the energy, trying to figure out what to do with this pain that I was experiencing. You're listening to Notes on Resilience. I'm Manya Chilinsky, speaker and advisor. My work examines how people and systems behave under pressure and what survival and disruption reveal about leadership, culture, and change. You can learn more about my work, including speaking and leadership support, at manyachilinsky.com/services. You can also subscribe to the newsletter at manyachilinsky.com/notes for monthly insights. Now, back to the show.
And how long did that last? And then what did you do?
The acute phase, I imagine, was relatively short, a week or two.
Mhm.
The bombing happened on a Monday. The following Monday, the city held a moment of silence for those who were killed in the event at the same time. And I watched it on TV, felt like I want to be part of this. And within about a half an hour after that ending, I was on the phone to my doctor's office asking to see someone in their behavioral health department. Something about that moment clicked in me that I'm not okay.
Mm.
And so definitely that first week was very acute stage. And I don't know what the stage below that is, but I was in that stage for probably several months, again, where I was showing up for life and you could see me and you might even not know anything was wrong. But all of this stuff was what was going on in the background, and it was difficult to focus on work. And I eventually got to a point where I could do work, but it was still difficult to focus. And still didn't necessarily want to share my story with my name attached to it. Early on, though, in that summer, a few months after, I started recognizing the fact that I felt invisible and the fact that there wasn't a lot of public support for survivors like me. There was some, and I kind of got into any of those pieces that I could. And I started to realize it doesn't have to be this way. If we actually understood that these kind of people have these kind of feelings after these major events, after disasters. And I started doing research and realizing, oh, people do know that this happens. And they're typically in an event like this, there are many more people who are experiencing mental health wounds than people who have physical wounds. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has a report, and it talks about disaster mental health, and mass violence is considered a disaster. And I sometimes get this number messed up, but I want to say it's between 4 and 50 people have a psychological wound for every one person who has a physical wound. So I started to realize
Yeah.
it's knowable. It is a known fact. We are somehow choosing not to pay attention to the mental health side or to talk about it very much. So that's when I started doing things like talking about it and reaching out to my city leaders, and that eventually led to getting on stages and talking about it and to where you and I are today. That came from a place of anger. I felt very angry, and that has been a defining emotion of my experience, has been anger throughout, and much less so today because I'm actively working to make some changes. I still can get really angry about things. And unfortunately, still today, as we're recording this, it's 11 and a half years later,
Mm.
still it is somehow codified in the experience that survivors like me don't count. So we don't get invitations to things that other survivors get invited to. And so it is not something that is just in the moment that they didn't pay attention to us. It was what set the course of the response and set the course of the lives of those of us who experienced only psychological wounds and didn't have physical wounds. So it was in starting to take some action that I started to feel better.
Right. Right. And that came from the anger.
Yeah.
Taking the action came from the anger.
Yes.
Yeah. That is fascinating, isn't it? That even though, or even what we know about mental health and what we know about the impacts of war and everything, and we're still not really focusing on mental health and the effects and the differences with the physical and the mental.
Sure, the reasons are more complex than one word, but I do think it has to do with the stigma of
Mm.
mental health issues. And a mental health challenge is personally defined. It's me not functioning the way that I usually function, and you can't see that. There's
No.
no blood, there's no obvious physical manifestation unless in some way you recognize my behavior change. But the world at large doesn't can't automatically see that. And I think we still, for whatever reason, don't trust people's self reports.
Yeah.
And because we can't see it, we can't prove that with an x-ray. And when we're talking about recovery from trauma and post-traumatic stress. And so I feel like it's stigma and it's maybe fear.
Mm.
If that could happen to you, it could happen to me. And it looks awful, and I don't want that to happen to me.
Yeah, I am rejecting this.
Yes. Yes. I reject your reality. Um, yeah. And honestly, I also think a little bit of it is a lack of awareness. It's not a malicious, I see this thing happening to you, and I don't care. I think it's also can be difficult for people if they haven't gone through something like this to understand what it feels like from the inside, of course, because they don't have that lived experience. For others who may have experienced something in the past, I think sometimes you don't want to see it because for all those reasons, I didn't get help, so we're not going to help you, or I don't even want to admit that something happened to me. So admitting that something happened to you means I have to deal with something in my own life that I don't want to deal with. So I think it's complex, but I do think some of it is maybe a lack of education or a lack of attention.
And I talk a lot on these different podcasts about lack of education around grief, the one thing that we are all going to experience in some form. And if we were just talking about it more, it might help. And I guess the question really is for you. So when did you realize that grief was playing a part as well?
Not until very recently.
Right.
So it was 2013, and I want to say that my recognizing that grief was playing a role was really probably just in the last couple of years when I started doing my own podcast and talking to people about their experiences. And I did an episode on grief. And I have now done a few episodes on grief. But that first one, right around then, was, I think, the first time I thought of that word in relationship to what was going on to me.
Making that connection.
Yes,
Mm.
I that was never a label that I would have used
Mm.
during my experience early on.
And in talking about it, you recognized it yourself. So just that sort of self-awareness piece.
I think so.
Mm.
And reading about it as it's interesting that you asked that because now I'm thinking about this. I happened upon several different grief experts, grief counselors, and would follow them on social media and read their things because a lot of the language and the communication about building awareness for people experiencing grief is very similar to building awareness for people who are experiencing trauma.
Mm.
And so I was taking those things in. You're very familiar with this, and I'm sure your listeners are too, with the phenomenon of people not knowing what to say after someone you love dies. Well, they also don't know what to say after you've experienced a bombing, for
Okay.
example. So I started reading those kinds of resources through the lens of, oh, yeah, that's the same if you've gone through a trauma, but didn't connect. Well, maybe that means what I was going through was grief. Like I didn't make that connection until I started doing the research and talking about it for my podcast.
Mm.
And I don't know if there's any reason behind that or if it was a fear of naming that as one of the experiences or if it just took me a long time to connect the dots for just whatever regular reason.
Well, like we don't really talk about it, do we? And that's the thing. We don't always equate grief to an event like that. Most people, when they're talking about grief, are talking about a bereavement, or of a close loved one. And that thing, it's talking about loss helps us understand loss is grief. And of course, you it's lost the life that you had, and the future. So. Yeah, I guess you're putting a label on it. We're putting a label on it, aren't we? But did it did it change things for you? Did it help then realizing that actually I'm grieving? What sort of was there was it a light bulb moment? Actually, I'm grieving, but did it make any changes for you? Did it help?
It's interesting you ask it that way because I'm not sure I actually had a light bulb moment and actively admitted to myself I am grieving the loss. And I honestly think that still is a little bit of resistance on my part. I still have resistance to dealing with some of the emotions that came up
Right.
um, because of this, which, it's pretty complex and also it touches all sorts of different areas of your life. And I realize that there are parts of the experience that I still have boxed away.
Yeah.
And I think talking about grief, I recognize it's part of the experience, and I haven't actually connected it personally to myself, if that makes sense. It's still in a box. I see the box and I see it has a label.
You just don't want to open it. Yeah,
Mm-mm.
we could keep that box over there.
There are other boxes, some which have labels, some don't. It's just in a pile.
Just over there. Just
Yeah,
over there.
I see it. I know it's there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We see you. And because this podcast is called Grieve Then Achieve, let's link it to achieving whilst grieving. How have you coped, and what would you suggest for anybody that's experienced anything even similar? I mean, what would you do? You have particular what worked for you? I suppose healthy, maybe not just eating crisps, but did you have healthy coping mechanisms? And your podcast is all about resilience, isn't it? So I mean, it's perfect because I guess it is about building resilience.
Yes. I did have a few coping mechanisms. And what's interesting is, I think is interesting, is again, in retrospect, looking back, I didn't know I was necessarily tapping into some of these things. And I can recognize them looking backwards. But in the moment, I just was doing what felt like I needed to do in the moment. So I mentioned that I got angry. So one of the things that helped me heal was taking some sort of action.
Mm.
I wrote letters, I started speaking, and realized that by sharing my story and putting my name to it, I was helping to get rid of the stigma about talking about this, and then I was going to be making a difference for people, even though I was probably never going to meet anybody that I made a difference for.
Mm.
Had to just trust that putting this out into the universe, and then that has become, the change in career that I have, and those things. The other coping mechanism, I would say two others. So one was leaning into therapy and counseling. That is something that traditionally works for me. So that was, I mentioned a week after I called the therapist at my doctor's office and said I need to come in.
Mm.
That is a way that works for me. And I know somebody who says that there's only three things that you need to heal from something like this, and it's time, talk, and tears.
Mm.
And that talk doesn't have to be to a therapist. It can be to family, friends, coworkers, a faith leader. In my case, therapy and doing some trauma specific counseling, both group and individual. And then the third thing that really helped me was mindfulness and meditation, and really starting to connect my mind and my body and recognizing my responses, and then learning techniques to calm my nervous system down in the moment when I needed to. And the fourth thing was exercise. And that ties really closely to the mindfulness and meditation because I started out by building up a yoga practice. I started with a trauma sensitive yoga practice and then moved into yoga in community studios and then on my own. And again, that was to get my body moving and get the stress and the trauma out,
Mm.
um, and also connected to that mindfulness. And I am a walker. I love to just set out for long walks. And that is also a big coping mechanism for me when I'm stressed. I will stand up from this desk, walk out the door, and just go for a walk. You're out in I live in the city, so sometimes I'm in nature, sometimes I'm in the city, but fresh air, moving, other people, it, I recognized how important it is to keep my body moving.
Yeah, yeah. That mind body connection, isn't it? There that we store so much in the body. And the book, The Body Keeps the Score, I recommend it all the time because it's just
I do too. Yeah.
incredible to
It's a
read.
little academic,
Mm.
but when you can get through some of those pieces, it's such good information at the core.
Yeah, I put it on audio. I found that a bit easier because I kept picking the book up and putting it down and picking it up and putting it down. And I was like, Kate, you need to get through this. So I put it on an audio book and that solved the problem. But it's
Excellent. Excellent.
just so informative and it is understanding that connection. And you're right, it's that there's yoga for grief as well, actually, which is interesting because again, storing it in the body. Yeah. Oh, we could just talk about this for forever. There's so many things I want to ask you and so much. But um I guess, to keep it kind of shortish, is there anything else that you wanted to mention that has come up for you now we're talking about things? Anything else that you'd like to talk about?
I think reminding people, reminding your listeners, as you are going through something like this, to let it happen. Let
Mm,
yourself feel the things you're feeling. And if the thing you're feeling is fear, or the thing you're feeling is that right now what you need is to isolate, then that's okay. That's what you need to do. Um, it's really just about when you're in the thick of it, it's just about surviving,
mm,
waking up in the morning, keeping yourself safe. Um, I will tell you that I was very worried early on. This is going to sound, I don't, well, it sounds strange to myself. I don't know how it's going to sound to your listeners, but I was very afraid that I was just going to walk in front of a car,
right, right.
that I was, that somehow all of this fear and pain,
Mm,
and I didn't specifically think of suicide. I wasn't specifically thinking I want to end this all. I
mm.
just was afraid if I'm walking down the street, I might just jump in front of a moving car.
Almost unconsciously.
Yes, yes.
Mm,
And and that was very scary, and I had to have conversations about that. I guess what I want to say is whatever you're feeling is normal. The fear, the uncertainty, the confusion, the not wanting to get out of bed, the not wanting to take care of yourself, the wanting to eat the corn chips for dinner. Like all of these things are just your body trying to deal with
yeah,
this massive
yeah.
trauma, or not so massive trauma, but that is feeling to you a massive trauma.
Mm,
And just have grace for yourself.
mm, mm. And it's so
And it's hard. That's really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that self-awareness piece, isn't it? It's understanding what's going on for you and being okay, especially with the grieving process. It's going through the grieving process. You can't go over it, you can't go around it. It catches up with you eventually. But you're right, it's that grace. It's allowing yourself to go through the process.
Yeah.
Um,
And early on, you can't necessarily name it. And you're just, if I stopped you on the street and said, is this what's happening to you? You probably wouldn't even be able to acknowledge it. So just trust that what you're doing is what you need to be doing.
mm,
And if you're scared about something like I was, then address it.
mm,
But don't worry, and also don't worry if you can't name the feeling or you can't figure out what you're feeling, because at some point you will, and
mm,
that
mm,
when you're ready to do that, I have become a believer in, that we deal with things when we are able to deal with them.
mm, mm.
And So having patience if in this moment I'm not quite able to deal with it.
Yeah. And obviously, as a trainee counselor and as a coach, I'm a huge advocate for talking. And I do think you just sometimes need to unpick what's going on, and that's what the talking does.
Yeah,
It can make
absolutely. You know, I repeat that time, talk, and tears.
mm,
I think that is how we get through almost everything.
yeah,
And just the time piece is hard. We all want to feel better sooner than we feel better. It's hard to have that patience. I still sometimes, 11 years, I still, every once in a while, something will hit me
yeah,
and I'll be crying or I'll have a beginning of an anxiety attack. And, rather than thinking, oh, come on, it's been 11 years,
mm,
I think, oh, okay, whatever. It's only been 11 years. I'm still feeling this. It was a lot of work to get to a point where that didn't bother me.
of course, of course. Patience and grace, as we said, as you said. Manya, it has been incredible. Thank you so much for your time. Like I say, we could talk for hours about this, but you've given us a little glimpse, and that has been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so pleased to share, and hopefully there's some nuggets in there that people can use.
Of course, absolutely. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to Notes on Resilience. I'm Manya Chilinsky, a speaker and advisor. My work focuses on how leaders support people through pressure and disruption. The show is edited by Neil Panji, and it's hosted on Buzzsprout. Subscribe to the podcast to stay connected and sign up for the newsletter at manyachilinsky.com/notes for monthly insights and updates.